Good morning and welcome to the third anticipatory briefing of this 2025 GESDA Summit. This morning we're going to discuss designing human futures. Advances in sensory research, design anthropology and participatory foresight are now catalyzing real-world transitions in energy, mobility and automation. How will these powerful approaches transform policy, technology, design and everyday life for the next 5, 10 and 25 years? This is what we're going to explore first through 15 minutes of presentation and then 15 minutes of questions. Our speaker is a Laureate professor and founding director at the Futures Hub and the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University from Australia. Please help me welcome Sarah Pink.
Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be here speaking you here at the GESDA Summit, and especially around the question of futures, which has come up so much even in the last day and a half that I've been listening and communicating with people here. So we're living in what's known now as a polycrisis world, where economic, social, technological, environmental, and geopolitical crisis collides. In this context, there's a growing demand for knowledge about futures to inform decision-making, which will hopefully enable better futures and try to solve some of these crisis situations. And in this context, there is a growing futures industry of consultancies and foresight agencies. And importantly, I was also so happy to see that GESDA is focusing on futures, which for me is one of the most enlivening aspects I've seen of this growing interest in futures in recent years. But in this context, there's also a big gap, and that's deep, engaged knowledge of our social futures and how our social futures will become part of societal futures, our everyday life futures, people futures. And this is what I believe we need to focus on as part of the transformation of our futures knowledge landscape for a polycrisis world. Now, until now, the social sciences have not adequately addressed the question of futures. Social scientists have very often tended to focus on our academic work, our intellectual conversations, and have not really engaged with the question of the future, those things that have not happened yet, the question of possibility. But a whole new group of us, myself and my lab and my Futures Hub based in Australia, and also my colleagues across Europe, we are developing a new futures-focused social science, which will deliver the whole new layer of knowledge we need about our social futures so that we can shift the narrative. Now, if you wanted to know about climate futures, who would you ask? Would you go to an engineer? Would you go to a computer scientist? You'd probably ask a climate scientist. But our knowledge or our assumptions about social futures in our contemporary society and world tend to be driven by tech-focused visions of futures, whereby it's assumed that technology will change society, technology will shape our future everyday lives. So to shift the narrative, we need a future social science, and that's what we're doing. So what's the wider context for this? What do we need? We need theory. Now, as social scientists, we see futures, theoretically theorized futures, as plural, more than one future, futures going alongside each other, imaginaries for possible futures. We don't try to forecast futures, we don't predict futures. We see futures as multiple possibilities. Let's think about which possibilities would lead us to trusted futures, which is what I believe we need to get to. So we work a lot with concepts. The concept of trust is a fantastic concept because it's used across all different academic disciplines. It could be a meeting point where we can look at our differences, we can work together towards futures which are trusted, by which I mean futures in which we feel comfortable, in which we can trust the environments we live in, we can trust the technologies we use, we can trust the social relationships and the institutional relationships around us. How can we work towards trusted futures? These, of course, are very difficult questions. How do we do our research? Well, if we really want to understand people and how people will want to feel and experience futures, what people's values will be in futures, what people's priorities will be in futures, and how people will actually shape the technologies that they use in their futures rather than the technologies shaping them, we need to get into society with people. Now, for people who are not anthropologists or sociologists, these are people. Lots of people from many different academic disciplines and sectors don't get into the real world and spend time with people in their homes, in their workplaces, in their cities, and there's many different environments people live in, but we do. We spend time with people in their everyday lives in their homes. And that's fundamental to our work. We also develop focused workshops with real people and with stakeholders, and together we seek to imagine possible futures which people will feel comfortable and happy and achieve levels of well-being in. Now, we also, as social scientists, as I said, we seek to reframe the narrative. I wanted to give you a tangible example of that so you can get an idea of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Now, this is about a reframing. This is part of our work. We work across all kinds of different sectors, across the energy sector, the construction sector, the mobility sector, the home sector, the city sector, and more. This is from one of our energy research projects. We wanted to reframe the narrative. The energy organisations we were working with assumed that in the future, people will want to set automated technologies and then forget about them, get on with their lives. They call it set and forget. But we know from our research that in the present and in possible futures, people want to stay in control of their technologies. They want information, they want to make decisions themselves. That's what our future life with AI, with automated decision-making and with quantum should be like. So we reset the narrative, we reframed it from set and forget to set and notify. So how do I see this developing? Well, let's look at 5 years. As I said, we're starting out to develop a new future-focused social science based on qualitative research, genuine insights and foresights from everyday life. Within 5 years, I expect us to have a new cohort of trained futures researchers from the social sciences. We're doing that already. Some of them are already merging into new work roles. I expect in 5 years for us to have active community participation. So people communicating with us in our projects and actually getting that knowledge from the community, from real people in real life, to understand possible futures from their perspectives. I also expect us to have a considerably more accessible communications and engagement from the social sciences. I showed you this last slide, which is from one of our very accessible reports. We publish our work in accessible reports, which are read by people across all sectors, and often sometimes in collaboration with our industry and government partners. We also create documentary films to communicate our work to industry and government partners, but also to wider publics. And we, of course, do very good academic work, which informs it all. And 2 examples from specific sectors we work with. This is from our work from the energy sector and our Digital Energy Futures documentary featured there. We want to move from uncertainties about future energy demand, and uncertainties about future energy demand are really based in uncertainties about how people will use energy in possible futures and how people will shape energy demand. We want to move from that to socially informed energy supply and infrastructure planning. If you get the infrastructure right, then the grid's not going to break down. It's very simple, and you need to understand future people to be able to get that planning right. In the cities example, we want to move from anxieties about city data privacy and planning, which come from ordinary people in everyday life, but also from our partners in the cities. They want to make sure they get it right too, to vibrant and trusted city data communities. How can we constitute the collection of data, the use of data, and then enabling citizens to also engage with data resources in ways which are trusted and which will bring about human well-being. Again, that's another project we've worked on. We've delivered our outcomes from that, and they're being used by the city we collaborated with. But then 10 years' time, let's move a bit further. What I'd like to see by then, in terms of our social science futures research capability, is established interdisciplinary futures research and communications training across all levels of society. I would like to see all kids in schools doing courses about futures and learning about futures, how to understand futures and how to live their lives with futures in mind. I would like to see all universities in all subject areas teaching at least 1 unit on futures so that people gain an understanding of how to apply their academic discipline that they're learning about to futures questions, but also how to think about futures as they live. I'd also like to see more communications training in graduate and postgraduate degrees so that we can actually communicate that work beyond academia. This is an example of an Antarctic futures game made by my colleague Juan Francisco Salazar's team, which is a gamified version of actually communicating and training people to think about Antarctic futures. So let's think about the creative resources that we can engage to get futures into our worlds and lives and education institutions. Oops. I'd also like to see, but in 10 years' time, an international bank of societal futures knowledge. These are a few examples from our mobilities research. Another sector we work in where one image is from a documentary film that we made, starting at the widest possible question, working with people with disabilities to think about how might we reshape mobilities futures from those perspectives. The other is from a workshop where we came up with the idea of slow future mobilities for 2050. And the other one is of an out-of-order electric vehicle charger, which is, of course, future tech is going to break. But my point here is that by 2010, I would like us to have an international bank of futures knowledge about social futures that we can draw on, that we can ask questions of, and that we continue to build up and contribute to. So any decision that is made about planning for futures actually has the resources to go to and the social sciences to analyse and share accessible findings to industry, to government, to diplomats, to those decision makers who need it. And the other opportunity we have for 10 years' time is not just to have technology that's ready to be used in society, but a society that's ready for technology. So there are two dimensions. One is about designing technology so it fits into the needs of future society and future people. The other one is actually making sure that society is prepared. Now, I'd like to see in 10 years' time us actually reaping the benefits of the research we're doing now in that 10-year perspective. And quantum is, I'm so excited that GESDA is working on quantum, and so many of you in the room are. Quantum is the most exciting example of that. With AI and with automated decision-making, the social scientists arrived too late. Too much critique, too much trying to engage with policy after the event when it's already gone wrong in many senses. Lots of things have gone right with that tech, but there are lots of things that social scientists could have helped to go better and more right if we'd been there first. So here, we've just started our quantum hub in my emerging tech lab. And the Quantum Futures Hub, we're an anthropologist and a designer, and we want to do real research with real people, with all the stakeholders, and we want to actually look at what future trusted quantum ecologies could look like and how we can work to those in Australia before quantum comes into our society with quantum hardware predicted for 2035 in 10 years' time. So I think this is our super exciting and important opportunity. Now, in 25 years' time, 2050 is another one of the key moments that we look at present. 25 years' time, I really want to see that whole cohort of futures researchers really blossoming. I would like to see it as absolutely our fundamental expectation that we have futures institutes in every country which are interdisciplinary, and that social scientists are fully integrated into interdisciplinary teams. Our capability will be massive, and also our ability to communicate outside academia will be fully established. It will be expected of us. Now, in terms of what our work has been looking at, then the interesting questions are, what might it be like to live in possible futures in 2050? How might we go about imagining that? Now, of course, we can't know that, but we can establish that there are certain principles that our research tells us about. So people will want to be able to care for themselves and others in possible futures. They will want to stay in control of emerging technologies. And they will want to be able to actually use robotics and AI and electric vehicles in ways that sustain their lives and sustain their well-being. So how do we work towards that? Now, another question is we might ask, well, how will people work in possible futures? Now, this is just one example, but what's so interesting about when we do work towards 2050 from the social sciences, we can start to think about, well, what are the new things that we can put into the tech-driven narratives? Now, construction work futures. Construction industry is a massive industry, super important for our global futures. It's not going to go away at all. In fact, we're likely to have construction on Mars, so how do we think about that? How do we really start thinking about this kind of new ways that construction will be in our world? Well, our work about construction work futures in 2050 we analysed all of the industry and government narratives, and we found that there are a limited number of future roles that were predicted and the skills that would be needed for them. A lot of them were just focused on how people and robots will work together. We found one particular role which stood out, which was the future tech troubleshooter. All of the people we worked with who are really embedded in the industry said, yes, but what's going to happen when the tech breaks? We know that tech breaks. And people who work in other industries also, and infrastructure organisations also know that tech's going to break. So somebody called me up about this work and they said, we want to talk to you about our future infrastructure and the future of work. And in the end I said, why did you call me? He said, I read your report and I saw the future tech troubleshooter and I realised that that's where we need to look. And that came from research with real people about how work will be experienced in 2050, not from the tech and business predictions and assumptions about what work futures are going to be like in that industry. So we need to listen to the people who have the expert knowledge of what things are really like in their worlds. And this finally for 25 years ahead. So this is actually a slide of a picture of my colleague Juan Salazar's documentary film, Cosmographies, which tells the story of future life on Mars in 2025, life and death on Mars in 2040, and then it goes back to real life in 2025 in the global south. So by 2050, we really will probably be living in a world where space travel, construction in space, and life in space could be a real possibility. Space will be potentially part of our lives and our everyday news items on Earth. How do we go about preparing for that kind of world, for that kind of knowledge, for that to be part of our everyday existence? Again, social science research, which will enable us to prepare society and to understand how that might come into our world and how we want it to come into our world. And also, so importantly, speculative modes of communication, like documentary films, speculative documentary, games, and other ways of engaging the community, other ways of teaching and learning, need to be part of that. So again, 25 years' time, let's think about space futures as well. So what's the outlook? Well, just to finish, I want to argue for society-ready futures. So let's think about how we constitute futures which are ready for society and for what society needs, and that means considering what the social needs, what people need. So engaging with qualitative futures knowledge, it now gives us a unique opportunity to create realistic, inclusive and ethical futures visions which attend to people, how we feel, how we sense, who we want to be in our possible futures. And I'll leave you with the hope that we can arrive at those trusted futures that I called for at the beginning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. We're going to put 12 minutes on the clock, please, for questions, so we try to finish on time. Do we have any questions? Please raise your hand. We're going to bring you a microphone. We have a first question here. Maybe while the microphone arrives, Sarah, let's be very concrete. So I go to a lot of events, and sometimes on stage you have people coming and they make these predictions like by 2037 you can upload your brain to the cloud. It's a famous one, maybe you know who I'm referring to. I got someone saying 2050 it's going to take 15 seconds for an AI to create a nuclear bomb. Like, I have no idea where this comes from. How do you recognize good and bad predictions? What are this? Help us understand like why we should be a bit careful with the prediction we hear, and where somebody talking about the future gives us a sign that what they say is, you know, more real in a way.
Yeah, like we can't predict the future with any certainty ever. But I think what we need to think about is when people give those kind of predictions, and often they're super genuinely excited about them and believe in them, right? We need to see them as possibilities. They are one possible future alongside many other possible futures. Because if you say our future will be one where we can connect our brain to a technology, well, that might be one person's future in their lab in 25 years' time or 10 years' time, but it won't be the future. Somebody else living in their home in a rural community who's actually opted out of all of that stuff. So yeah, many possible futures and many things to consider when we engage with them.
Exactly. So be very careful when you hear certainties about the futures. Somebody who's making prediction, remind them that they should not give conferences. They should play on the stock market if they know how the world is going to end. Please state your name and your question. Thank you.
Sure, I'm Katarzyna Wlodymirova from Post Growth Fashion Agency. Are you familiar with the work of Rob Hopkins? Probably you are. He works on the transition scenarios for the cities, and he's developed this methodology of community-based envisioning the future. And it's been immensely successful in groups as big as a city council or as big as several hundred people and as small as a few people. He's done some really impressive experimentations in Europe and beyond, I think in Australia as well. And that is future planning on the ground, which is similar to what you said, that you go straight to people. And if so, do you see value if you worked or, if you know about this line of work, how do you see this merging with the new discipline or interdisciplinary field of studies that you're preparing?
Yeah, so I see that community envisaging with people on the ground as really important because it generates new knowledge, it generates new collective sentiment and possibilities. But my point here is, and I don't know of his work, so I don't want to comment on it specifically, but my point here is about a new social science and bringing the theories and the concepts, the intellectual agility, the analytical ability and capability of social scientists to this field. And that's where the enormous gap is. So I have every respect for the work that community participatory foresighters do and that people who do community futuring, the work that design researchers do. There's a lot of work around futures in design. I collaborate with designers a lot in my work, but there is an essential gap, which is what I talked about at the beginning. Like, if you wanted to know about climate futures, wouldn't you ask a climate scientist? If you want to know about social futures, ask a social scientist. And the social sciences are now ready to start addressing those questions. And I believe that one of the reasons why we weren't involved in the past is that we weren't actually ready. We didn't have that mode of engagement or that mode of futures thinking within the qualitative social sciences until now.
Raise your hand if you have a question. We have one there. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Aude. I'm really happy to see this because I've been doing research on ethno-future. And I do agree we're kind of doing research and design in future, like the way we're doing in design, etc. Have you seen methodology? I think social scientists have things to say into that, into looking how humankind went through the past and how we're going to tackle the future. Have you seen any methodology that are tackling those questions? And if not, I would be really happy to speak with you.
Yeah, no, I'd love to discuss with you, but I would say that I see a lot of value in taking that perspective, which learns from the past and learns from history to try to understand how society will develop into possible futures. I guess, again, I would come back to the point that as social scientists and for me as a futures anthropologist, design anthropologist, and also a filmmaker, for me, there is something new in terms of bringing our methodologies for being in real life with people, in really intensive and sometimes longer-term ways, to futures research. So, but I'm very excited to learn about what you've been doing as well. Thank you.
History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, as Mark Twain famously said. And looking at history is always super interesting.
Yeah.
Because also something you mentioned is that every time there's a change, there are these fears. And you showed this image of people being scared in public space.
Yeah.
And then you have to reassure them by involving them in their own future. And so history is a good tool to reassure people. Because do you agree that future is scary or fascinating? People
It's both. It's always both.
How do you deal with that? And then we move on to this gentleman's question.
I think it comes back to the point I made about quantum. AI is scary. AI is problematic. AI is out of control, but AI is doing amazing things in medical diagnostics, in all kinds of fields. It's helping people in everyday life. But we still have a terrible set of problems and questions around AI and the harm that it's bringing about. And so if the social sciences could be better involved in the process of planning and understanding how emerging technologies will become part of social lives, everyday life, everyday activities. That's what's so important, to actually fill that gap by learning from history, working towards the present. And I would also acknowledge all the fabulous work that lawyers and ethicists and philosophers and other theoretical disciplines do in regulation and governance and planning for emerging technologies. But there is still this very important gap, which is that deep engagement with real people, and those real people who don't necessarily even exist yet, but who are going to experience emerging technologies in possible futures. What do we do to make sure that their everyday lives feel right, feel comfortable, feel full of hope and trust?
Sir.
Thank you, Sarah. Michael Hingartner. Social sciences is a very broad field, right? So a lot of our future life will be determined by the political system we're in, by the societal structures where these people will live in. So to what extent can you interact with, already now, with political scientists, with psychologists perhaps, to jointly see how these different elements will come together to affect the daily lives of people in 25 years?
Yes, no, I absolutely agree. So in my lab, we have one political scientist who does absolutely amazing critical research about emerging technologies and makes such important key points about democracy and how democracy is challenged or constituted through technological questions. So it's super important to have those insights from the political sciences. And again, from psychology, psychologists understand those real questions around the way that individuals think and individuals behave. And sometimes the qualitative social sciences come up against each other a little bit. So psychologists are very keen on behavior change and how we might change people's behaviors. And anthropologists can say, well, you can't change people's behaviors, but you can actually try to understand how to make things fit in better with people's behaviors, and then things will actually shift in other ways. So for me, it's so important to listen to the political scientists and the psychologists and actually think, well, we all actually make it work when we engage with society. So how can we very pragmatically harness our differences in ways that are generative and productive? And again, with the economists, and economists are fabulously interesting because they always have been future-oriented and they've never feared or found it difficult to engage with the future. So I think, again, some of those, and design, which is why I've engaged with design so much, some of those disciplines which are cognate to mine actually have enabled me to have the confidence to leap into the future, because it shouldn't be a problematic space for qualitative social scientists at all.
And very often the problem posed by technologies gets solved by a mix of social changes, education, and technology is the small part. Think of like cars. It took regulation and driving license, which are not technological stuff, to regulate it. Sir, your question, please.
Yes, my name is Gabor Farkas. I suppose if you consider, future and how things will evolve, you also look and take what comes from the past. There's a scientist called Peter Turchin who studies cycles, and his science is called cryodynamics. How do you account for his perspective on the cycles that we are coming out of and entering, which suggests that we may be going towards uncertainty, meaning something akin to what happened at the beginning of the 20th century?
I don't know his work, so I'll preface my answer with that. I think uncertainty is a super interesting question. For me as an anthropologist, it's often said we live in times that are even more uncertain than times have ever been before. I don't think we do. I don't think uncertainty is anything that gets bigger or smaller. I think uncertainty is actually something that is continual, and it's about acknowledging it and actually seeing what the uncertainties of our particular moment is. In terms of cycles, I'm not sure if we can necessarily apply a cyclical approach to everyday life and the way everyday life is experienced. I think that if we want to understand how real people are going to experience everyday life, then we need to really understand what everyday life feels like, what people's values are, what their priorities are, what their ethics are. And human life is so diverse and so evolving in so many different ways that I think it would be difficult to envisage an inclusive, cyclical model of the way that human values and ethics and experiences and priorities actually evolve in everyday life. But I think on other levels, maybe it's in some ways maybe looking at the way government and institution and politics and those kinds of wider societal organizations and sentiments, maybe a cyclical approach is applicable to them. But I would say that often anthropology will contest systems and cyclical and those kinds of models. But as I said before, I want that contestation, those challenges always to be in a generative way. So what can we learn more about everyday life by asking questions about cyclical change, even if we don't learn about cycles? And what can we learn about cyclical change if we consider more how everyday life might, and the changes in the everyday and the way we live in our mundane lives, how does that complicate some of those assumptions to actually strengthen the way in which they work?
Sarah, we have to close, but I need to ask you something.
Okay.
We for the past 20 years, we're in a world where if you're looking for the future when it comes to technology, you would look at Silicon Valley. And now things are much more complicated.
Yeah.
Like China has the #1 university in computer science now. There was a recent report 1 month ago, actually coming from Australia, ranking every country on 35 emerging technology, and China was like leading on 29 of them or something.
Yeah.
Where are you looking now if you want to look at the future of emerging technologies, and where are you looking in the world?
I think that we need to look at site-specific applications of emerging technologies. So as an anthropologist, I would acknowledge, of course, everything you said, that emerging technologies are being advanced and developed in certain places in the world, and that's very important for geopolitical relations and global economic relations. But maybe we need to also ask about the sovereign capability of different nations to develop their own technologies, which is something that's very important to many countries, but also to thinking about, well, these different countries and different communities and the smaller units you get, individuals' everyday lives, they're not just landing sites for technologies that are developed somewhere else. So a technology perfected or advanced in China is not going to land in Australia or in another country in the world and just change that society. That society and that organization and that group of people living in a household are all going to shape the way in which that technology becomes part of their lives, their communities, their organizations and their nations. So we need a much more site-specific and nuanced approach to understanding the impact that tech, wherever it comes from, has. But we also do need to remember where it comes from.
Thank you very much. Sarah Pink, ladies and gentlemen. And we come back here at 11:45 for our next briefing on the science of language and communication. Thank you very much, Sarah.